On a crisp autumn morning in Manhattan's financial district, Michelle Thompson straightened her Hermes scarf and adjusted her tailored Chanel suit before pushing through the revolving doors of Heritage National Bank. As the CEO of Thompson Tech Solutions, a billion-dollar cybersecurity firm, she was accustomed to commanding respect in any room she entered. Today, however, would prove different. The marble lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the click of her Louboutin heels echoed across the polished floor. She was here for what should have been a routine business loan to expand her company's East Coast operations, a mere $50 million, backed by assets worth 10 times that amount. Ms. Thompson? A young assistant approached. Mr. Wells will see you now. Richard Wells, the bank's regional manager, didn't bother to stand when Michelle entered his corner office. His eyes barely flickered from his computer screen as she took a seat. The Harvard diploma on his wall seemed to mock the Princeton degree in her portfolio. So, he drawled, finally looking up. You're requesting quite a substantial loan. His tone carried the kind of condescension Michelle had fought against her entire career. Yes, Michelle replied, maintaining her professional composure. As my application shows, Thompson Tech Solutions has demonstrated consistent growth of 40% year over year. Our current contracts with the Department of Defense alone. Ms. Thompson. Wells interrupted, leaning back in his leather chair. Let's be realistic here. This is a significant amount of money, and our bank has certain standards. Through the glass walls, Michelle noticed a white businessman being warmly welcomed into another office. She recognized him as the owner of a struggling startup that had filed for bankruptcy protection twice. My financials exceed your standard requirements by every metric, Michelle stated firmly, sliding forward additional documentation. Our credit rating is perfect, our collateral substantial, and our market position. Perhaps, Wells cut in again, closing her file without even glancing at the new documents. You might want to try a smaller loan. Or maybe one of those special minority business programs. We find they're more appropriate for certain applicants. The implications hung heavy in the air. Michelle felt her jaw tighten. But years of dealing with such prejudice had taught her to maintain her composure. Mr. Wells, are you suggesting that my application is being denied based on something other than my company's qualifications? He smiled thinly. I'm simply saying this particular loan may not be the right fit for someone like for your type of business. At that moment, Michelle watched through the glass as the white businessman left the other office, waving approved loan documents triumphantly. I see, Michelle said quietly, reaching for her phone. Would you mind if I made a quick call? Wells shrugged, already turning back to his computer, dismissing her presence. Michelle stepped into the hallway, her fingers flying across her phone screen. First, a text to her board chair. Then, a call to her legal team. Finally, a message to her investment banker. Within minutes, pieces were falling into place that would change everything. As she waited for responses, she observed the bank's operations. She noticed how customers of color were consistently directed to junior associates, while white clients got personal escorts to senior managers. She saw the security guard following a black couple more closely than others. She watched a Hispanic business owner being turned away despite his thick portfolio. Her phone buzzed. 3 messages arrived in rapid succession. Board approval, unanimous. Legal, documents ready. Investment banker, funds secured. Michelle allowed herself a small smile. She had been considering this move for months, watching Heritage National's stock price decline due to poor management. The discrimination she'd just faced wasn't just personal anymore, it was the final catalyst for action. She straightened her jacket and walked back into Wells's office, this time without knocking. Mr. Wells, she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made him look up sharply. I believe we have unfinished business. The day was far from over. And Richard Wells had no idea that his world was about to turn upside down. Richard Wells's smug expression froze as Michelle Thompson placed a single document on his desk. It was a notice of acquisition intent, bearing the letterhead of her holding company. "What is this?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly as his eyes scanned the paper. "That, Mr. Wells, is notification that Thompson Global Holdings has just acquired a controlling interest in Heritage National Bank's parent company." Michelle's voice was calm, but her eyes held steel. "As of 4 minutes ago, my consortium owned 51% of your bank's shares." The color drained from Wells's face. This is impossible." "Is it impossible because I'm black, Mr. Wells? Or because I'm a woman?" Michelle settled into the chair she'd occupied earlier, crossing her legs deliberately. "Or perhaps it's impossible because you were too busy making assumptions to actually read my file?" Through the glass walls, a commotion was building in the lobby. Men and women in expensive suits were streaming through the front doors, Michelle's legal team and board members arriving right on schedule. "Your bank has been undervalued for months," Michelle continued, watching Wells squirm. "Poor management, declining customer satisfaction, and most importantly, a pattern of discriminatory lending practices that's about to become very public. My team has been tracking it all." She opened her briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "In the past year alone, Heritage National has denied loans to minority-owned businesses at 4 times the rate of white-owned businesses with identical or worse credit profiles. Did you think nobody was paying attention?" Wells reached for his phone, but Michelle shook her head. "The board chairman has already been notified. In fact, he's the one who approved the sale. Your old Harvard connection couldn't save you this time." The bank security team was now escorting Michelle's executives to the conference room. Through the glass, she could see her PR team setting up for the press conference that would begin in 30 minutes. But your loan application," Wells stammered. "Was a test," Michelle finished. "One that you failed spectacularly. We needed to document one final instance of discrimination before proceeding with the acquisition. Thank you for being so predictable." She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. "You know, my father tried to get a loan from this very bank 30 years ago. He had a brilliant business plan. Perfect credit and more collateral than required. He was denied by a man who looked just like you, sat in probably that same chair, and made the same assumptions you made today." Turning back to Wells, she continued, "He built his business anyway, without bank support. I bought my first company at 25 with the money he left me. Now I own this bank. Funny how life works, isn't it?" The conference room was filling up with executives, both from the bank and Michelle's team. Through the glass, she could see the panic spreading across the faces of the bank's senior management as they realized what was happening. "You have 2 choices, Mr. Wells," Michelle said, straightening her jacket. "You can resign immediately, or you can stay and learn to be part of the solution. Either way, things are about to change dramatically at Heritage National." Before Wells could respond, Michelle's phone buzzed. The press was arriving in the lobby. Right on schedule, reporters from major networks were setting up their cameras. This story would make headlines across the country by evening. "The press conference begins in 20 minutes, Michelle informed him. "I'll be announcing comprehensive reforms to address systemic discrimination in our lending practices. We'll also be launching a $500 million initiative to support minority-owned businesses, ironically, about 10 times the loan amount you denied me today." Wells slumped in his chair, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly. "I want you to watch and learn," Michelle replied. "I want you to see what real leadership looks like. And most importantly, I want you to understand that the world is changing, with or without you." She gathered her documents and headed for the door. Pausing briefly. "Board meeting starts in 5 minutes. I expect all senior management to attend. Don't be late, Mr. Wells. Your education begins now." As Michelle strode toward the conference room, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor, she could feel the shift in energy throughout the bank. Employees whispered and pointed, realizing they were witnessing history in the making. The transformation of Heritage National Bank was about to begin, and Richard Wells was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his career. 6 months into Michelle Thompson's ownership of Heritage National Bank, the institution was undergoing a revolutionary metamorphosis. The marble halls that once echoed with exclusivity now buzzed with diverse voices and new energy. On a bright Monday morning, Michelle stood before the bank's assembled staff in the newly renovated main hall. The space, once adorned with portraits of past, exclusively white male presidents, now showcased artwork from various cultures and featured a wall dedicated to successful community investments. "Today marks another milestone," Michelle announced to the gathered employees. "Our first quarter under the new lending guidelines shows a 200% increase in approved loans to minority-owned businesses, with a default rate actually lower than our previous average." In the front row, Richard Wells shifted uncomfortably. His role had been radically redefined, from rejecting minority applications to heading the bank's new division of community development and inclusion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Mr. Wells," Michelle called out, a slight smile playing on her lips, "would you like to share the results of your recent community outreach program?" Wells stood, noticeably humbled but with a new sense of purpose in his bearing. "Yes, Ms. Thompson. Our pilot program has successfully provided financial literacy workshops to over 5,000 community members. We've also established partnerships with 27 minority-owned businesses that were previously denied loans under my former leadership." The transformation wasn't just statistical. The bank's workforce had changed dramatically. The executive team, once predominantly white and male, now reflected the diversity of New York City itself. New hiring practices had brought in talent from historically overlooked communities, and the results were showing in both customer satisfaction and profit margins. Michelle implemented a groundbreaking Second Look program, where all previously denied loan applications from the past 5 years were reviewed under the new, bias-free criteria. The stories that emerged were both heartbreaking and inspiring. One such story belonged to James Rodriguez, a brilliant Hispanic engineer who had been denied a loan 3 times under the old regime. Now, with proper funding from Heritage National, his green energy startup was revolutionizing solar technology and employing over 50 people from underserved communities. But numbers and policies are only part of the story, Michelle continued, pacing the floor. True change comes from transforming hearts and minds. She gestured to the new training center visible through the glass walls, where mandatory anti-bias workshops were in session. The program, developed in partnership with leading civil rights organizations and psychology experts, had become a model for other financial institutions. Richard Wells raised his hand. Something that would have been unthinkable in his previous incarnation as the arrogant regional manager. "Ms. Thompson, may I share something with the team?" Michelle nodded, curious. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I represented everything wrong with banking, the bias, the discrimination, the casual racism wrapped in policy language. Ms. Thompson could have fired me. Instead, she forced me to confront my prejudices by putting me face to face with the people I had wronged. The room was silent as Wells continued. "Last week, I approved a loan to a black woman entrepreneur who reminded me exactly of Ms. Thompson. Under the old system, my old system, I would have rejected her without a second thought. Her business plan is now one of our most promising investments." Michelle watched as several employees wiped away tears. The transformation wasn't just institutional, it was deeply personal for many in the room. The bank's new mentorship program paired experienced bankers with aspiring entrepreneurs from underserved communities. The results were spectacular, new businesses were flourishing. Communities were being revitalized, and the bank's reputation was soaring. "We're not just changing a bank," Michelle declared, concluding the meeting. "We're changing an industry. Every loan approval, every new hire, every policy change is a step toward a more equitable financial system." As the assembly dispersed, Michelle noticed a young black girl pressing her face against the bank's window, looking in with wonder. She remembered being that girl, dreaming of a future that seemed impossible. Now, she was creating that future for others. The transformation of Heritage National wasn't just about banking, it was about hope, opportunity, and the power of turning rejection into revolution. 1 year after Michelle Thompson's historic takeover of Heritage National Bank, the institution had become a beacon of progressive banking and social change. The Wall Street Journal's front page headline read, "Heritage National sets new standard in inclusive banking, industry giants follow suit." The bank's main hall was packed with journalists, industry leaders, and community members for its annual stakeholder meeting. The atmosphere crackled with excitement as Michelle took the stage, her presence now commanding respect rather than resistance. 1 year ago, she began, "I stood in this building as an unwelcome loan applicant. Today, I stand before you with proof that ethical, inclusive banking isn't just morally right, it's profitable." The screens behind her displayed the impressive numbers, profits up 45%, customer satisfaction at an all-time high, and loan default rates at historic lows. But the most striking statistics were about impact: over 3,000 minority-owned businesses funded, 15,000 new jobs created in underserved communities, and a revolutionary mortgage program that had helped 2,000 families become first-time homeowners. Richard Wells, now Executive Vice President of Community Development, stepped up to share his perspective. His transformation had become a case study in corporate leadership evolution. When Ms. Thompson bought this bank, he admitted, "I thought it was about revenge. I was wrong. It was about vision, seeing potential where others saw risk, seeing humanity where others saw statistics." The presentation shifted to success stories. Sarah Chen, whose tech startup had been rejected 3 times under the old regime, was now employing 200 people and had just secured a government contract. Marcus Rodriguez's community health clinic network, funded through Heritage's new healthcare initiative, was revolutionizing medical access in underserved neighborhoods. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Michelle invited Gloria Washington to the stage. The 67-year-old grandmother had been denied a small business loan by Heritage National 15 times over 20 years. Now, her soul food restaurant chain was expanding to its 10th location, with Heritage National as its proud financial partner. "This isn't just about money," Gloria declared, her voice strong with emotion. "It's about dignity. It's about being seen. Under the old Heritage National, I was invisible. Under Ms. Thompson's leadership, I'm not just a customer, I'm part of a community." The bank's transformation had ripple effects throughout the industry. Major financial institutions were scrambling to adopt Heritage's inclusive banking models. The Federal Reserve had begun studying their practices as a potential template for national banking reforms. Michelle announced the launch of the Heritage Institute for Financial Inclusion, a think tank dedicated to researching and promoting equitable banking practices. The institute would offer fellowships to scholars from underrepresented communities and partner with historically black colleges and universities. "But our work isn't finished," Michelle emphasized. "True change requires sustained commitment. Today, I'm announcing a $2 billion initiative to expand our inclusive banking model nationwide. We're opening branches in 20 underserved communities across America." The audience erupted in applause as she continued, "We're also launching a free online financial education platform, available in 12 languages. Knowledge is power, and we're making sure everyone has access to it." Richard Wells watched from his seat, remembering his first meeting with Michelle. The man who had smugly dismissed her loan application now led workshops teaching other bankers about unconscious bias and inclusive lending practices. As the meeting concluded, Michelle shared one final story. "Last week, a young black girl came into our branch with her mother. She pointed at my picture on the wall and said, 'Mommy, I want to own a bank too.' That's what change looks like, not just in spreadsheets and statistics, but in the dreams we make possible." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Outside, television crews prepared their evening news reports. Inside, employees and customers mingled freely, the old barriers of race and class dissolved by a year of revolutionary change. Heritage National Bank had become more than a financial institution, it was a model for how corporate America could transform itself, one decision at a time, into a force for social justice and economic equality. As Michelle looked out over the crowd, she smiled, knowing that somewhere, another little girl was dreaming big dreams. And now, thanks to the new Heritage National Bank, those dreams had a fighting chance of coming true. The story of Heritage National wasn't just about banking anymore, it was about America's future. And that future looked brighter than ever.